الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله تعالى فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله حتى أتاه اليقين أما بعد. Ladies and gentlemen, all praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of being praised and thanked for the blessings that He has given us, for the blessings that you and I realize He's given us, and from the blessings that you and I do not realize or take for granted that Allah has given us. From our health, from our wealth, from our prosperity, from our safety, from us being allowed to come to a masjid safely, to worship Him, for us having the freedom to practice our religion, for us having access to health care, for us having access to our basic needs such as water. And as I'm saying this, I know each and every one of you knows part of why I am saying this, because these are basic needs that are being deprived from people across the world, whether they're recovering from earthquakes or floods or subjected to wars in Palestine. We're not even going to call it a war, as it is a genocide, and in many other areas of the world. So say alhamdulillah for what you have, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to feed those who are hungry, and to clothe those who do not have sufficient clothes, and to shroud those who have been martyred, and to accept the shahada from each and every one of them, and to allow us to serve Him in a way which is pleasing to Him from where we are, so that we can help them and anyone who is oppressed across the world. So we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His infinite blessings. Whomsoever Allah guides to the straight path, there is none that can misguide such a soul. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make me and every one of you amongst those guided people. And whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows to go on a path of misguidance, there is none that can guide such a soul. And we seek refuge from the evil of ourselves and from the evil of shaitan in the human and jinn form, from being from amongst them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatih wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. O you who have attained faith, be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, have Allah in your heart to the degree that Allah is worthy of being in your heart. Be conscious of Allah in a manner which is due to Allah, and do not die, do not leave this world, do not have your soul extracted from your body unless it is in a state of submission to that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. So you and I do not choose when we leave this world, but we can choose how we leave this world. It could be later today, it could be weeks from now, it could be years or decades from now. That part does not matter. What matters is when our soul is extracted and our time on this earth is done, that it is leaving into the next dimension, into the next and permanent life, in a manner which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that hisab for us easy, makes that journey into the next world an easy one, and into a better world than this flawed one that is here. Brothers and sisters, as we continue to see the unfolding of what's happening in Palestine, something that sticks to my heart is, how do I make this cause something that enters the American consciousness? How do I make the struggle of our Palestinian brothers and sisters something that enters the consciousness of the average American, who is still has some level of trust, whether it's for the mainstream media or the mainstream narratives that are put out there? And brothers and sisters, we're only a couple weeks removed from Thanksgiving, which is a holiday that is ostensibly celebrated between these pacts of agreement and mutual benefit between pilgrims who have colonized the United States and the relationships they'd had with certain Native American tribes, when in reality, that's a cover. That's the pretense for the genocide that the pilgrims imparted upon the Native Americans. That's really what it was, okay? And so in a conversation I had with my 8th grade and 7th grade history teacher, when this first started, one of the first things I said to him was, you know, I wish the average American would realize the similitude of the struggle of the Palestinians to that of the Native Americans. And it opened up a different type of conversation. And this is a more similar thing than we would think. We can talk about the colonization aspect, but I actually want to talk a little bit about the Native Americans in a way that maybe we don't hear very often. Summarizing from a book called The Gospel of the Red Man. The Indian Bible is what the book is called. It's written by a British historian by the name of Ernest Thompson Seton. You see, we know now something like colonialism was seen as an attractive mechanism of exploiting the world, and it was pushed out and labeled as something that could bring benefit to the native population, but the 2020 hindsight, and obviously the people living it, could see the exploitation that was happening. And for those who don't understand the definition, colonialism has to do with occupying a land and a people and exploiting it for your gain, the conqueror, the person who's taking over. And what we saw in this country and in Canada and in different parts in South America as well as Latin America, that is what happened to the indigenous people in this country. And so the reason I'm talking about this is when you want to give da'wah to somebody, speak in the language that works to them. When you want to call a doctor to Islam who maybe is questioning God, you might speak in a different way than to an engineer or a computer scientist or a layman or a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker. You might speak to them a little bit differently. The message is tawheed at the end of the day. But what resonates with their heart might be a little bit different. The language you use might be different, but the message is the same. And that's why I'm going down this route, because we live in a particular place right now with a people who viewed historically the indigenous Americans, the Native Americans, as a beastly people, as a savagely people, in what is called manifest destiny, which is a 19th century construct which basically says because of the white man's superiority, we are destined to continue to expand across North America. To continue to expand across North America. Now that sounds great, but what's implied obviously is the superiority of the white man and therefore their worthiness over the land to make best use of it, and how they have the burden, the white man's burden, of civilizing the indigenous population, of civilizing the beastly people, the subhuman people that live there. And the United States used this in the Congress amongst their elected officials beyond just that. Of course with slavery, of course with their conquests, as they call them, of the Philippines and different islands. Same logic, the same exact logic. And this is the same logic that colonial powers such as Britain, such as the Dutch, such as the Belgians and the French used when they were taking over large swaths of land and committing genocide and atrocities and ethnic cleansing. So that's what they were doing to the Native Americans. Now, who were the Native Americans? Because they like to point out that the Native Americans were these polytheistic folks who had mythological types of beliefs and were quite far from a monotheistic faith. But in this book, interestingly, The Gospel of the Red Man by Ernest Thompson Seton, and this is a book that's being written reflecting on what is known as the Victorian era of England, and he's a British historian. And for those who understand the Victorian era of England, this was, as you would say, the golden days of Christendom in England, in terms of how, quote-unquote, beautiful they had portrayed Christianity in their societies. They had good family structures, they had good neighborly relationships. This was the peak, perhaps, of Christianity in England. And this is how he's describing the Native Americans. First of all, their description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this book is describing the word for God they use, or the Great Spirit, is Tirana, which means the omnipotent, magnificent, beneficent one, upon whom everything depends and who needs nothing in return. The one you rely on for everything. Sounds a whole lot like Ayatul Kursi and Qul Huwallahu Ahad, does it not? Reflecting on their moral system, this person who's a Christian says the moral system of the Native Americans is the closest thing I've seen to what I would imagine was the moral system at the time of Moses, is what he described. He said there was never a hunt except that the people who went out on a hunt dropped large amounts of meat at the houses, first to the poor, to the widows, to the elderly. This is what they did. He described them as, and he's operating from an area where he doesn't have interaction with Muslims, but he said, they're the best Christians I've ever seen. They're the best Christians I've ever seen, is what this man is describing the Native Americans as. Henry Benjamin Whipple, who's quoted in this book, refers to them as the noblest men, the bravest and most fierce warriors. Our worst wars were against them, not because they were a barbaric people, but because they were strong men. Because they were strong men. And he continues to reflect, along with Neil Erickson, another person quoted in this book. He says, there was never a war against the Native Americans except I was ashamed for the flag I was carrying, for the country I was representing, and for who I was fighting with. If I knew what I know now, I would have left my people and joined the Apache Indians or the Iroquois Indians. They were the finest men I knew, is how he describes them. He says, they were far superior to us in terms of a civilizational standpoint. Their only weakness was that they did not have the mastery of metals. What does that mean? Their only weakness is they did not have the technological advances that the colonizers had. That's it. And this is where we sometimes get in this flawed way of thinking that my civilization is defined by how strong I am. It's defined by how many Apache helicopters I have, how many tanks I have, how many nuclear weapons I have. That's not what defines a civilization. A civilization, as is put by people of moral courage and moral strength, is defined by how you treat the most vulnerable people in your society. How you treat the poor and the downtrodden, the disabled, the widows, the single mothers, the elderly. This is what describes and this is what defines the strength of a society and a civilization. And we see very clearly here how somebody who's coming from the peak of Western Christianity is describing the people that they are committing genocide against as a far superior folk, as a far superior people. Reflect on that, and we'll close out in the second part of the khutbah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم من كل ذنب فاستغفروه تجدوه غفورا رحيما. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Wallahi, we have things to learn from the Native Americans, both in terms of what unfortunately happened to them, but because of where they were morally. We see that in their ceremonies, in their weddings, in their festivities, they always had, it's mentioned in this book, they made sure that the poor, the widows, the orphans, the elderly were at their ceremonies. Let us look at our ceremonies and what do we do? Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam tells us, بِئْسَ الطَّعَامِ طَعَامَ الْوَلِيمَةِ يُدْعَى إِلَيْهَا الْأَغْنِيَاءُ وَيُتْرَكُ الْفُقَرَاءُ. The worst food is the food of the gathering and the ceremony in which the rich people are invited and the poor people are not. The rich are invited and the poor are not. Please remember this when Ramadan comes around. Please remember this when you're celebrating your son and daughter's aqiqah. Please remember this when somebody in your family is getting married. Please remember this when you're saying assalamu alaikum to people after salah. Please remember these things. You see, I shared this because, again, when we compare to what is happening in Palestine, it's important for us to know the audience we're talking to. The United States, even though it did what it did, and it continues to exploit the Native Americans, by and large in the history books, it gets it right what happened to the Native Americans. And people look back, obviously they can't do anything to change the history, but they look back at it with horror, understanding to a reasonable degree how terrible that history was. And the Native Americans who were being exploited, who were being massacred, fought back against them. And they killed from amongst the colonizers. And they raided villages, largely moral wars, but there were perhaps atrocities that were committed in terms of them perhaps having killed some women or children. But you can never, never remove the context of them being a people who had genocide committed against them. Same thing with the black Americans who were brought as slaves. You know, people, when they look back at the massacre that Nat Turner organized, and there were scores of white people who were massacred, historians never remove the fact that he was a slave and had no future, no hopes. They recognized him as actually a very intelligent person. A very intelligent person. They never separated who he was and what he was exposed to and the depravity of the conditions that the slaves were subjected to when looking at the actions. And so when you look at a people who have their backs against the wall, who have their basic needs taken away from you, who are fed with an eyedropper, and that eyedropper can be taken away at any point, and who have tried to protest peacefully, only to be not recognized, and who have appealed to the international community, who have given you nothing more than a few sound bites, but have never done anything to hold the oppressor, to hold the colonizer, to hold the person responsible for genocide or ethnic cleansing responsible. Nothing will happen. What do you expect to happen? And then you want to equate the actions of the people whose backed are pressed against the wall to an almost infinite military capacity that will be funded non-stop. You can never compare the two. You can never compare the two. And so do not fall into that trap. Help people realize who is the oppressed. Help them see that the language that was used to describe the Native Americans, that was used to describe the blacks, that was used to describe the people in North Africa, the Muslims in North Africa and in West Africa, that was used to describe the Indians in the Indian subcontinent, is the same language that the Zionists used to describe the Arabs. Churchill described the Indians when they were dying in the millions due to famine as it's being their fault because they reproduce like rabbits, calling them animals, and referring to the Palestinians as cockroaches walking on two legs, or as beasts with two legs, or as animals. There's no mistake between the language that is used. And the models of colonialism and oppression are the same in both areas. So center the narrative and center the discussion depending on who you're talking to. And say it in the best possible way, with prophetic character, to try and awaken people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspire each of us to use the right words. May Allah inspire us to have conversations with people who are good-hearted. May Allah give us the composure to have these conversations in a way which is prophetic. May Allah allow us to guide people to the truth in this and the truth, the ultimate truth, which is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give refuge to those who are suffering, feed those who are hungry, and heal those who are sick. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim fil alamin innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma ighfir lil muslimina wal muslimat wal mu'minina wal mu'minat al ahya'i minhum wal amwat innaka sami'un qareebun mujibud da'awat wa aqimis salat.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت